To the rest of the world, she was simply a quiet 84-year-old woman sitting by her living room window, no longer relevant, no longer capable, just a problem her children were quietly trying to solve. They had already signed the paperwork, already reserved the room, already decided her fate without asking her a single word. What they never imagined was that on the morning they came to collect her, Vivienne Marsh would be gone, behind the wheel of her own car, driving alone into the Tennessee mountains toward a place no one in her family even knew existed, carrying a secret her late husband had buried for 30 years and a will to live that none of them had ever given her credit for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Viv Calloway-Marsh was 84 years old, and she had lived long enough to recognize the particular kind of silence that precedes a verdict. It was the same silence that had settled over a hospital waiting room when the doctor had walked in with news no one wanted to hear. The same silence that fills a room when people have already made up their minds and are simply gathering the courage to say it out loud. She sat in her reading chair near the living room window, the one with the good afternoon light that Edmund had positioned there himself, measuring the angle of the sun at different hours like the careful, deliberate man he had always been. The chair was a deep olive green, now faded at the armrests from decades of use, worn into the shape of her the way only something truly loved can be. On the table beside her sat a half-finished cup of chamomile tea and a library book she hadn't opened in 3 days, not because she had lost interest, but because her mind had been too occupied with what she knew was coming. Carolyn was in the kitchen, speaking to Brett in the low, clipped tones people use when they don't want to be overheard but haven't quite committed to whispering. Vivienne could hear every word. She had always had exceptional hearing, a fact her children had long underestimated, perhaps because they had grown so accustomed to equating age with diminishment that they never paused to verify what was still sharp and what had merely softened with time. The coordinator at Harborview said the room on the 2nd floor faces the garden, Carolyn was saying, the crisp efficiency in her voice that Vivienne had long recognized as her eldest daughter's armor against anything that required sitting with discomfort. It's actually quite lovely. There was a cancellation. The waiting list is usually 6 months. We'd be foolish not to take it. She's not going to like it, Brett said quietly, his voice lower, more uncertain. He had always been the one most likely to waver, not out of genuine conviction, but out of an almost constitutional aversion to conflict. She doesn't have to like it, Carolyn replied flatly. She just has to be safe. Vivienne set her chamomile tea down very carefully, making no sound, and looked out the window at the oak tree in the front yard that Edmund had planted the year Nolan was born. It was enormous now, its canopy spreading wide over the front lawn, casting long shadows across the grass in the late afternoon light. She had watched that tree grow from a sapling barely taller than her knee into something ancient and certain, rooted so deeply in that ground that no storm had ever come close to moving it. She knew exactly how that felt. She had lived on Sycamore Ridge Drive for 47 years. She had brought 3 children home to this house. She had cooked thousands of meals in that kitchen, repainted the front porch herself twice when the wood began to show its age, planted and replanted the flower beds along the front walk until they bloomed precisely the way she envisioned. This house was not simply a structure of timber and plaster and old window frames that rattled when the wind came in from the north. It was the physical record of her entire adult life, of Edmund's life, of everything they had built from nothing together, side by side, over the course of more than 5 decades. She was not confused. She was not fragile. Her knees protested on cold mornings, and she had made the sensible decision to stop driving after dark 18 months ago when her night vision had become unreliable in heavy traffic. But she still drove herself to her medical appointments across town, to the grocery store on Tuesdays, to the small community pottery class she attended every Thursday morning with a group of women who knew her simply as Viv, who asked her opinions on things and actually listened when she answered. She managed her own medications with a system she had designed and refined over several years, color-coded weekly cases with a handwritten reference chart tucked inside the cabinet door that her doctor had called, at her last checkup, impressively thorough. Her mind was not only intact, in many ways it was sharper than it had been in her 50s, clarified by age, no longer cluttered by the frantic pace that had consumed her middle years raising children, managing a household, building a life alongside a man who appreciated every bit of her. But her children had stopped seeing that. Somewhere in the past 2 years, The careful, capable woman she was had been quietly replaced in their eyes by a category: elderly parent, liability, a source of growing concern. The phone calls had changed in quality. The visits had taken on the feeling of inspections, and Carolyn had begun arriving with a list of changes she considered necessary, rearranging things in Vivienne's kitchen without asking, unplugging appliances she deemed unnecessary risks, speaking to her mother in the patient, slightly elevated tone one uses with someone who is believed to be only partially present. Vivienne had watched all of it and said very little. She had learned, over 8 decades of living, that some battles were better won quietly than loudly. But inside, beneath the composed expression she maintained for her children's comfort, something had been tightening for months. Now, listening to Carolyn discuss the garden view from a room at Harborview Senior Living with the same efficient detachment she used when scheduling contractors, Vivienne felt that something reached its absolute and final limit. She looked at Edmund's oak tree. She thought of his hands, his voice, his particular way of loving her, steady, unassuming, and deep as a root system no one ever saw. And for the first time, she began thinking very seriously about exactly what she was going to do. Vivienne Calloway had been 23 years old when she met Edmund Marsh at a Civic Hall dance in Cookeville, Tennessee, in the autumn of 1963. She had gone reluctantly, persuaded by her younger sister who believed strongly that life did not come to you if you stayed home waiting for it. Edmund had been 26, recently returned from 2 years working construction contracts in Georgia, quiet in the particular way of men who have spent a great deal of time in their own company and have come to be comfortable there. He had asked her to dance not with the practiced ease of someone experienced at charming women, but with a straightforward sincerity that she had found, in that first moment, more disarming than any charm could have been. They had talked for nearly 2 hours that evening, long after the dancing had thinned and the hall had grown quiet around them. They talked about the kind of things people rarely discuss at first meetings: what they believed in, what they were afraid of, what they wanted from a life that still felt at their ages more open than settled. Vivienne had spoken about her desire to travel, to see the mountains of other countries, to learn things beyond what her small Tennessee hometown had been able to teach her. Edmund had listened with complete attention, the kind that made her feel that what she was saying mattered, that she was being heard rather than simply waited on. They married 18 months later in a modest ceremony at her family's church, with her mother in the front pew crying quietly and her father shaking Edmund's hand for a long time afterward in the way that men of his generation expressed approval. It was not a grand wedding or an expensive one, but Vivienne had worn a dress she and her mother had made together from ivory satin, and she had carried wildflowers from her mother's garden, and when she had looked at Edmund across that altar she had felt, with a clarity she would remember for the rest of her life, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They settled in Cookeville, where Edmund established himself as a building contractor with a reputation for exactness and reliability, a man who did what he said he would do, on time, within budget, without drama. His business grew steadily over the decades, never spectacularly, but solidly, built on referrals and repeat clients who trusted him completely. Vivienne had worked as a bookkeeper for a local medical practice for many years, contributing to the family finances while managing the household and raising their children with the same methodical care she brought to everything she undertook. They had 3 children. Carolyn arrived first in 1967, a serious and determined child who had always known exactly what she wanted and had grown into a serious and determined adult who still did. Brett came 4 years later, gentler than his sister, more given to accommodation, a man who had built a pleasant life for himself, largely by avoiding the kind of friction Carolyn sought out and conquered. Nolan was the youngest, born in 1975 when Vivienne was 35 and Edmund had laughed with surprise and delight at the news, and he had grown into the most emotionally perceptive of their children, the one most likely to notice what was actually happening beneath what was being said. Edmund and Vivienne had been partners in the fullest sense of the word, not just in household management or parenting or finances, but in the deeper sense of 2 people who had built their understanding of the world partly through each other. He had never once dismissed her instincts or talked over her in conversations where she had something to contribute. He had consulted her on every significant business decision, trusted her counsel, valued her intelligence in an era when many men of his background had considered their wives' opinions a courtesy rather than a resource. It had been a good marriage, not frictionless. No honest partnership spanning 51 years could claim that, but good in the ways that endure and compound over time. growing richer as the years laid more of themselves down across the foundation they had built together. Edmund had died 2 years earlier, in the January of a particularly cold winter, from complications following a surgery that should have been straightforward and wasn't. He had been 81 years old, still sharp, still working occasionally in a consulting capacity, still the same man in all the essential ways. Vivienne had held his hand at the end and had not looked away, and in the weeks and months that followed she had done what she had always done, moved through what was difficult with steadiness and without complaint, and rebuilt her days around what remained. She had been fine, more than fine. She had been quietly, stubbornly, wholly herself. She had simply not counted on her children deciding, without her input, that being herself was something she could no longer be trusted to do. The family meeting happened on a Sunday afternoon, 10 days after Vivienne's 84th birthday. She had known it was coming the way you know a storm is coming before the sky has fully committed to it. Something in the pressure of the air, something in the way her children had been moving around her lately, with that particular careful quality, as though she were a conversation they were rehearsing. They had gathered at her house on Sycamore Ridge Drive, all three of them, which in itself was unusual enough to confirm what she already suspected. Carolyn sat on the sofa with a leather folder open across her knees, papers arranged with the organized intentionality of someone who had prepared for resistance. Brett sat beside her, his posture slightly collapsed, the body language of a man who had already been talked into something and was hoping the hard part would be over quickly. Nolan sat in the armchair across the room, his hands clasped together, his expression carrying that particular tension of someone who was not fully at peace with what was about to happen, but had not yet found the courage to say so out loud. Vivienne sat in her reading chair and waited, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed into the careful stillness she had learned over a lifetime of navigating moments that required more patience than she felt. "Mom," Carolyn began, her voice arranged into the register of someone delivering difficult news with great personal sacrifice, "we've been talking as a family, and we feel it's time to have an honest conversation about your situation." "My situation," Vivienne repeated, her voice perfectly level. "You're living alone," Carolyn continued, leaning slightly forward. "You're 84 years old. The house is too large for one person. The yard requires maintenance you shouldn't be doing at your age. And frankly, anything could happen at any moment, and none of us would know until it was too late." "I've been living alone for 2 years since your father died," Vivienne said, "and I have managed perfectly well during that entire time." "For now," Brett said, in the tone of a man repeating something he had heard enough times to believe it. "But we have to think ahead. We have to make arrangements before there's a crisis rather than after." "We've actually already done quite a bit of research," Carolyn said, opening her leather folder and producing a glossy brochure with the words Harborview Senior Living printed across the front above a photograph of a sunlit garden path. "We've visited Harborview in person. It's an excellent facility. Private rooms, a full activities program, medical staff on site around the clock, meals provided. It's genuinely lovely, Mom. You'd have everything you need within a single building." "What I need," Vivienne said carefully, "is to be in my own home." "That's not realistic anymore," Carolyn said, and the flatness with which she said it, the complete absence of any space for disagreement, hit Vivienne somewhere deep and precise, like a key turning in a lock she had hoped would never be tested. "I've been realistic for 84 years, Vivienne said, her voice quieter now but no less steady. "I raised 3 children in this house. I managed every aspect of this family's life for decades. I balanced the books for a medical practice for 22 years. I have never once in my life been unrealistic, Carolyn, and I would appreciate you not beginning to describe me that way now." There was a brief silence. Brett looked at the floor. Nolan looked at his mother with an expression she could not entirely read, something between admiration and apology. "We've already put your name on the waiting list at Harborview," Carolyn said, her voice not unkind but immovable. "There was a cancellation. The room won't be available for long. We've paid the initial deposit to hold it." The room went very still. "You put my name on a list," Vivienne said slowly, "without asking me." "We were trying to be proactive," Brett offered. "You made a decision about my life," Vivienne said, looking at each of her children in turn, "without involving me in any part of it, without asking what I wanted, without considering that I might have a preference about where I live and how I live and what happens to my remaining years." "Mom, we're trying to help you," Nolan said quietly, and she could hear that he meant it, that his discomfort was genuine, that he was the only one in the room who actually understood the weight of what they were doing. "We're worried about you." "I know you are," Vivienne said. "But worry is not the same as respect. And what you have done today is not help. It is a decision made for me, not with me, by people who have decided that my age cancels out my right to choose." The silence that followed was long and heavy and uncomfortable for everyone in the room. And underneath Vivienne's calm exterior, beneath the composed expression she refused to surrender, something had already begun to shift, quietly, deliberately, and with the absolute certainty of a woman who had made up her mind. After her children left that Sunday evening, satisfied with themselves in the particular way of people who have confused control with care, Vivienne sat alone in her reading chair until the room grew dark around her and the oak tree in the front yard disappeared into the night. She did not turn on the lamp. She sat in the darkness and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened, the humiliation of it, the grief of it, the quiet and burning anger of it, without softening any of it for anyone's comfort, because there was no one left in the room to perform composure for. Then she stood up, moved slowly down the hallway to the bedroom she had shared with Edmund for 47 years, opened the bottom drawer of his old mahogany dresser, and lifted out the tin box she had been aware of for 2 years without fully allowing herself to understand what it meant. Edmund had shown her the box 3 months before he died. He had been characteristically matter-of-fact about it, sitting on the edge of the bed with the box open across his knees, explaining its contents in the same measured way he explained everything, thoroughly, without dramatics, with complete confidence that she was capable of understanding and handling whatever he was about to tell her. "There is a property," he had said, "up on the Cumberland Plateau. 40 acres and a small cabin, about an hour outside of Crossville. I bought it in 1991 under your maiden name, Vivienne Calloway. I want you to know it's there. I want you to know it's entirely yours." She had asked him why he had kept it from her for so long, and he had looked at her with that particular expression of his, the one that combined deep affection with a kind of patient certainty, and said simply, "Because I was saving it. Because I wanted you to have something that was yours completely, something no one could reach if you ever needed it." She had thought at the time that she understood what he meant. She had not understood it nearly as well as she did now. She carried the tin box to the kitchen table and opened it under the light. Inside was a small iron key on a plain ring, a folded property deed bearing her maiden name, a sealed envelope addressed to her in Edmund's careful handwriting, and a separate sealed envelope addressed to Carolyn, Brett, and Nolan. She had read her letter the night he showed her the box and had wept for a long time afterward. Now she unfolded it again and read it slowly, drawing from it the same thing she had drawn from it that first night, the steadying certainty of being truly known by someone. "My dearest Viv," it began, "I know our children. I love them unreservedly, but I know them, and I know that the day will come when they will decide, out of genuine love and genuine fear, that they know better than you do how your life should be lived. I know this because I have watched Carolyn move through the world, her entire life, believing that competence gives her the right to decide things for others. And I know that when that day comes, you will be tempted to go along with what they want, because you have spent a lifetime making yourself smaller so that others could be comfortable. I am asking you not to do that. Not this time. The cabin on the plateau is yours. I have made certain of that legally and completely. The deed is in your maiden name. The property taxes are paid through a trust managed by Arthur Peña, who has instructions to ensure you have full access to funds for as long as you need them. There is $120,000 in that trust, Viv. It is yours alone. The children have no knowledge of it and no access to it. I need you to know something else. You can still drive. You know those roads. You have made that drive with me more times than either of us could count, and you know every turn of it by heart. The cabin is ready. I made sure of it. Go there if you need to. Go there and be free. All my love, always and entirely, your Edmund." Vivienne folded the letter, placed it carefully back in the tin box, and sat for a long moment with her hands resting flat on the kitchen table. Then she took a slow breath and began to think. She had 12 days before Harborview's deposit deadline, which Carolyn had mentioned with the brisk certainty of someone closing a negotiation. 12 days in which her children would be watching her, visiting frequently, moving steadily toward the conclusion they had already decided on. 12 days was enough. She had organized more complicated things in less time. Vivienne Calloway-Marsh opened the tin box again, lifted out the small iron key, and held it in her palm. Then she reached for the notepad she kept on the kitchen counter and began, very quietly, to make a list. The planning took Vivienne the full 12 days. She was methodical about it in the way she had always been methodical about things that truly mattered, working through each detail quietly, thoroughly, without rushing, and without telling a single person what she was doing. She needed to pack light. Her car, a silver sedan she had owned for 9 years and maintained with the same careful consistency she brought to everything, was reliable but not spacious. She chose one bag, a wheeled duffel Edmund had bought years ago for a fishing trip he had taken with Brett, and filled it with careful precision over the course of several evenings, a few items at a time so that nothing would look different to Carolyn during her frequent check-in visits. Practical clothing suitable for mountain weather, layers she could add or remove depending on what the plateau offered when she arrived. A 3-month supply of her medications, accumulated by filling prescriptions slightly ahead of schedule over the preceding weeks, a precaution she had begun almost instinctively, as though some quieter part of her had known this day was coming before her conscious mind had fully caught up. Her important documents, identification, the property deed, the tin box with Edmund's letters, the small iron key on its plain ring, 2 photographs. One of Edmund taken on their 35th anniversary, standing beside the oak tree he had just planted, squinting pleasantly into the afternoon sun. One of all 3 children at Christmas 15 years ago before everything had grown so complicated between them. She told Carolyn on the Friday before her planned departure that she was feeling worn down and intended to spend the weekend resting quietly at home. She asked her not to visit Saturday or Sunday. Carolyn had agreed with the efficiency of someone whose schedule had just been cleared of an obligation, and the ease of that agreement had confirmed something Vivienne had been carefully trying not to examine too directly, that her children's concern for her, genuine as it was, had begun to resemble management far more than it resembled love. She set her alarm for 4:30 in the morning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She woke before the alarm sounded. She had barely slept, lying in the dark listening to the familiar sounds of Sycamore Ridge Drive in the early hours, the occasional car passing on the street below, the oak tree shifting in the wind outside, the faint, steady tick of the hallway clock that Edmund had wound every Sunday morning for as long as she could remember. At 4:15 she rose and dressed in the dark, moving slowly but with complete intention. Warm slacks, a soft flannel shirt, her heaviest cardigan, the walking shoes with firm soles her doctor had recommended 2 years earlier. She made no coffee. She did not want the smell of it lingering in the house as evidence of a morning she had not spent sleeping. She drank a glass of water at the kitchen sink, standing in the dark, looking out at the back garden where early spring had already begun pushing green shoots through the soil of the flower beds she had tended for decades. She carried her bag to the garage and placed it carefully in the back of the silver sedan. She opened the garage door manually, slowly, so the motor would not disturb the neighbors. Then she sat in the driver's seat for a long moment with both hands resting on the wheel, and she did not allow herself to think too deeply about what she was doing, because she had learned across 84 years of living that too much thinking was the enemy of necessary action. She backed down the driveway at 4:43 in the morning, eased quietly along Sycamore Ridge Drive, and turned onto the main road heading east toward the plateau. The streets of Cookville were nearly empty at that hour, washed in the amber light of street lamps that had always made the town look to Vivienne like something suspended in time, familiar and slightly dreamlike simultaneously. She drove steadily, hands at 10 and 2 the way Edmund had taught her on a back road outside of town the summer before they married, her eyes clear, her movements unhurried. She was not afraid of driving. She had been driving these Tennessee roads for 60 years. She knew every bend of the route to the Cumberland Plateau, the way she knew the layout of her own kitchen, by instinct, by repetition, by the particular intimacy of paths traveled so many times they become written into the body itself. As she cleared the edge of town and the streetlights gave way and the dark Tennessee countryside opened up wide around her, Vivienne felt the steering wheel solid beneath her hands, felt the road unspooling ahead into the darkness, felt the cool pre-dawn air coming faintly through the window she had cracked 2 inches, and she felt something else, something she had not felt in longer than she could precisely name. She felt entirely, unmistakably like herself. The sun was fully up by the time Vivienne turned off the main highway and onto the secondary road that climbed toward the plateau. She had been driving for just under 2 hours, stopping once at a gas station outside of Sparta to use the restroom and fill the tank, moving through the transaction with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been taking care of herself for 8 decades and saw no reason to stop now. The road to the property was not marked on any signage she could find, which was entirely consistent with Edmund's deliberate nature. He had never done anything carelessly. If he had wanted this place to remain private, it would remain private. She found the turn by memory, a narrow gravel lane branching left between 2 cedar trees whose trunks had grown wide enough in 30 years to nearly obscure the gap between them. She eased the sedan between them carefully, feeling gravel crunch under the tires, and followed the lane as it curved gently upward through a dense corridor of hardwood and pine. The cabin appeared after approximately a quarter mile. It sat on a modest clearing that opened without warning from the trees, and the suddenness of it, the way it simply materialized from the forest as though it had grown there rather than been built, caught her breath in a way she had not anticipated. It was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown accustomed, over the decades since she had last seen it, to the version of it she had carried in memory, which was always slightly larger and more golden than the real thing. But it was solid. The roof was intact. The porch boards looked sound. The windows were clouded with the particular film of long disuse but unbroken. Edmund had built things to last, and this was no different. She sat in the car for a moment, after she cut the engine, looking at it through the windshield in the cool morning light. Then she opened the door, stepped out onto the gravel, and stood in the clearing listening to the silence of the plateau, which was not truly silence at all, but a deep, layered quiet composed of wind moving through high timber and birdsong from species she could not identify, but whose sound was clean and unhurried and entirely indifferent to her troubles in the best possible way. The iron key turned in the lock on the first attempt. Of course it did. Inside, the air was cool and close, carrying the particular closed-up smell of a space that has been sealed against the weather for a long time. Wood and dust and something faintly herbal she could not immediately place. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The main room held a small sofa, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a narrow kitchen along one wall with a propane stove and a deep farmhouse sink. A stone fireplace occupied most of the far wall, clean swept, with a basket of firewood stacked beside it. Edmund had always kept firewood stacked beside a fireplace. He had never trusted the assumption that warmth would be available without preparation. She found the light switch. A single overhead lamp came on, its light warm and immediate, and something in Vivienne's chest that had been braced for difficulty quietly released. She spent the first hour simply making the space habitable, opening windows to move the stale air through, wiping surfaces with a cloth she found folded under the kitchen sink, checking the propane tank beside the back door and finding it adequately full. The well pump, operated by a small electric switch on the kitchen wall, ran clear after a few seconds of brown-tinged hesitation. The bathroom was functional. The bedroom at the back of the cabin held a plain iron-framed bed with a folded quilt across the foot of it that she recognized, blue and cream, hand-stitched, made by her own mother decades before she died. Edmund had brought that quilt here. He had thought of that. She pressed her hand flat against it and stood there for a moment without moving. It was in the bedroom closet that she found the second box, smaller than the tin one she had brought with her, made of dark wood, sitting on the shelf above the hanging rail with a strip of paper taped to its lid that read, in Edmund's handwriting, "For Viv, when you get here." Her hands were not entirely steady as she lifted it down and carried it to the kitchen table. The latch opened without a key. Inside, folded around a small bundle of documents, secured with a rubber band, was a letter. She recognized the weight of the paper before she had even unfolded it. The same cream stock he had always used for anything he considered important. She sat down, smoothed the letter open under the kitchen light, and began to read. "My darling Viv, if you are reading this, you did it. You drove yourself up here, alone, on your own terms, exactly the way I always knew you could. I am so proud of you I cannot adequately express it." She had to stop there and breathe for a moment before she could continue. Edmund's letter went on to explain the documents folded alongside it, the property deed in her maiden name, the trust account details, the name and direct telephone number for Arthur Peña, who managed the funds and was expecting her call whenever she was ready. $120,000, structured and protected and entirely hers. a second sealed envelope addressed to her children in Edmund's hand, and at the end of the letter 3 sentences that she read 4 times before she folded the page. You have spent your whole life taking care of everything and everyone. This place is where you come to be taken care of by no one but yourself. That is not loneliness, Viv. That is freedom, and you have earned every inch of it. Vivienne Calloway-Marsh sat at the kitchen table in the cabin on the Cumberland Plateau that her husband had built and preserved and left entirely to her, and she wept with the particular release of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has finally, in the right place in the right moment, been given permission to set it down. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after Vivienne had disappeared from Sycamore Ridge Drive. She had been expecting them, not with dread exactly, but with the particular braced readiness of someone who is prepared for a difficult conversation and is simply waiting for the other party to show up and begin it. She was on the porch when she heard the car coming up the gravel lane, the sound of tires on loose stone carrying clearly through the plateau quiet long before the vehicle itself appeared between the cedar trees. 2 cars, as it turned out. Carolyn's white SUV followed closely by Brett's blue sedan. She watched them pull into the clearing and park and sit for a moment behind their respective windshields before the doors opened, as though they needed a few final seconds to agree on how this was going to go. All 3 of them had come, Carolyn first, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had rehearsed this, Brett behind her, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes scanning the cabin and the surrounding tree line with obvious discomfort. Nolan last, closing his car door quietly, looking at his mother on the porch with an expression that was more complex than either of his siblings, relief and guilt, and something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like reluctant admiration. "Mom," Carolyn said, her voice tight with the compressed weight of 11 days of fear and frustration, "do you have any idea what you have put us through?" Vivienne looked at her 3 children from the porch steps and felt the strange calm that had been settling over her more completely with each day she spent on the plateau. A calm not of resignation, but of absolute certainty about who she was and what she wanted. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." "We don't need coffee," Carolyn said. "We need an explanation. We called every hospital in 3 counties. We filed a missing persons report. We have been terrified, Mom. Genuinely terrified." "I left a note on the kitchen table," Vivienne said. "A note," Brett repeated. "You left a note saying you were fine and not to worry." "That's not an explanation. That's not enough." "It was enough information to know I was safe," Vivienne said calmly. "Which is what actually mattered." "What matters," Carolyn said, her voice rising slightly before she brought it back under control, "is that you are 84 years old and you drove alone for 2 hours to a cabin in the middle of nowhere that none of us even knew existed. Do you understand how dangerous that was? Do you understand what could have happened?" "What could have happened," Vivienne said, "is exactly what did happen. I drove here safely, I arrived without incident, and I have been living quite comfortably for the past 11 days on my own terms in a place I have every legal right to be." She paused. "Come inside, please. This conversation deserves to happen somewhere warmer than a gravel driveway." They came inside. She could see them registering the cabin, the clean surfaces, the organized kitchen, the fire laid neatly in the grate, the library book open face down on the sofa table, evidence of a life being lived with intention rather than endured with resignation. She poured coffee for anyone who wanted it. Nolan accepted a cup. The others stood with their arms crossed, still too coiled with emotion to settle. "We've already cancelled the Harborview reservation," Nolan said quietly. "When we realized you'd left deliberately, it didn't feel right to keep it." Vivienne looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "That doesn't solve anything," Carolyn said sharply. "You still can't stay here permanently. It's isolated. There's no nearby medical care. You're alone with no support system of any kind. If something happened to you up here, we might not know for days." "Your father knew I might need to come here," Vivienne said, and she watched the shift that moved across all 3 of their faces at the mention of Edmund, a softening that happened involuntarily, the way it always did. "He set this property up in my name 30 years ago. He made sure I had the means to live here independently and with dignity. He respected me enough to plan for my freedom even after he was gone." She pulled Edmund's sealed letter from the table beside her and held it out toward Carolyn. "He also left something for the 3 of you," she said. "He anticipated this conversation. He wanted you to understand why this matters and why I am not leaving." Carolyn took the envelope with slightly unsteady hands, looking at her father's handwriting across the front with an expression that cracked something open in her carefully maintained composure. "You can read it together tonight," Vivienne said, her voice gentle now but entirely unwavering. "And then, if you'd like to come back tomorrow and talk, really talk, the way this family used to before you all decided I needed managing, I will be here, right here, in my home, on my terms. That is what I am offering you. I hope very much that you'll take it." The silence that followed was long and fragile and full of things none of them yet knew how to say, but it was, Vivienne thought, the most honest silence they had shared in years. 3 months later, Vivienne Calloway-Marsh sat on the porch of her cabin on the Cumberland Plateau and watched the sun rise over the eastern ridge in long, unhurried bands of gold and rose, and felt, with the quiet completeness of someone who has finally stopped arguing with their own life, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The transformation had not been without its difficulties. There had been mornings when her arthritis made the short walk from the bedroom to the kitchen feel longer than it should, when the isolation pressed in rather than opening out, when the doubt that visits everyone who has made a bold and irrevocable choice came calling in the small hours and asked her, in its reasonable and persuasive voice, whether she had been foolish rather than brave. She had learned to let those mornings pass without giving them more weight than they deserved. By afternoon they were always gone, replaced by the steady and accumulating certainty of someone living precisely as she had chosen. Carolyn had called 4 days after the confrontation at the cabin, 2 days after reading Edmund's letter. She had cried on the telephone in a way Vivienne had not heard from her eldest daughter since childhood, unguarded, unpolished, without the armor of competence and efficiency that Carolyn wore so habitually it had begun to look like a personality rather than a defense. "Dad was right about us," she had said, her voice stripped down to something genuine and raw. "He said we had turned you into a problem we were trying to solve instead of a person we were supposed to love. He said we had confused keeping you safe with keeping you controllable. And he was right. I'm sorry, Mom. I am genuinely sorry." Vivienne had accepted the apology with the grace it deserved, which was considerable because she understood what it had cost her proud eldest daughter to make it. Carolyn was not a woman who apologized easily or often. She had been raised, as many women of her generation had been raised, to treat the admission of error as a form of weakness rather than a form of integrity. That she had found her way past that instinct to say what needed to be said, that Edmund's letter had reached something in her that arguments and resistance had not, mattered enormously to Vivienne, not because she needed the validation, but because she needed her daughter back, the real one, beneath the management and the efficiency and the leather folder full of brochures. And she could hear her, finally, in that unguarded voice on the telephone. Brett had called the following day, quieter and more halting than Carolyn, less practiced at emotional honesty but no less sincere. He had admitted that he had gone along with the Harborview plan not because he believed it was right, but because disagreeing with Carolyn required a kind of sustained effort he had never been good at cultivating. He was working on that, he said. Vivienne told him she was glad to hear it, and she meant it, and she also told him something she had wanted to say for a long time, that his gentleness had always been one of his greatest qualities, and that she hoped he would stop allowing other people to use it against him. He had been quiet on the other end of the line for a moment, and then he had said, very softly, that was the most useful thing anyone had said to him in years. Nolan had driven up to the cabin alone the following weekend and sat with her on the porch for 3 hours, drinking coffee and talking in the way they had always talked most easily, without agenda, following whatever the conversation wanted to become. He told her he had known something was wrong with the Harborview plan from the beginning, that he had felt it in his chest as a wrongness he could not fully articulate against Carolyn's organized certainty. He had lacked the courage to say so clearly, and that failure had been sitting heavily with him since the moment they had found the house on Sycamore Ridge Drive empty and understood what she had done. "I should have spoken up," he said. "I should have said it wasn't right to decide for you without you." Vivienne had looked at her youngest child, this man in his late 40s who had always felt things more deeply than he knew how to express, and told him that speaking up against the momentum of a decided group was one of the hardest things a person could do, and that she hoped he would be readier next time, and that she loved him without reservation or condition regardless. At the end of those 3 hours he had hugged her for a long time without saying anything, and she had felt in that silence everything that needed to be expressed between them. They had established a rhythm that worked, A visiting schedule the children rotated through once or twice a month, bringing supplies and spending a night or a weekend, learning to be in her space on her terms rather than arriving with the implicit purpose of assessing whether she still met their standard of safe. The visits had grown warmer as the weeks passed. The old ease between them was returning slowly, like circulation coming back to something that had been compressed for too long. Carolyn had stopped bringing her leather folder. Brett had started arriving with food he had cooked himself, dishes from their childhood that Vivienne had not tasted in years, filling the cabin kitchen with smells that belonged to a time when her children were young and needed her, and the relationship between them had been uncomplicated by worry and power, and the particular grief of watching a parent age. Nolan had brought his guitar on his third visit and played on the porch after dinner while the plateau darkened around them, and Vivienne had sat listening with a fullness in her chest that she had not experienced in longer than she could precisely measure. She had found a doctor in Crossville who made monthly visits to remote patients across the plateau, a practical woman in her 50s who examined Vivienne thoroughly and declared her cardiovascular health remarkable for her age, adjusted 2 of her medications with careful explanation, and never once suggested that her living situation was a problem requiring correction. She had found a small grocery delivery service that came every 2 weeks, operated by a young man named Darius who was unfailingly cheerful and had taken to leaving her small extras, a jar of local honey once, a bunch of wildflowers another time, without making anything of it. She had cleared and planted a kitchen garden along the south-facing wall of the cabin that was already producing more than she could eat alone, and she had begun leaving baskets of vegetables on the porch for Darius to take back with him, which felt like the right kind of exchange. She had made a friend, Wanda, who lived 12 miles down the main road and ran a small plant nursery out of her property, had stopped by one afternoon after hearing through the loose network of plateau residents that someone new had moved into the old cabin up the Cedar Lane. She was 68, sharp and funny, and entirely without the habit of treating Vivienne as though her age were the most interesting thing about her. They had talked for 2 hours that first afternoon and had been talking regularly ever since, on the telephone on the days between visits and in person when Wanda brought seedlings and stayed for lunch. She had given Vivienne 3 varieties of heirloom tomato for the kitchen garden and strong opinions about the best way to stake them, and both the tomatoes and the opinions had proven entirely worthwhile. She had begun tentatively to write, not for anyone else, not yet and perhaps never, but for herself. Long entries in a notebook she kept on the kitchen table, recording what she saw from the porch in the mornings, what she thought about in the afternoons, what Edmund had meant to her, and what this place meant to her, and what it felt like, at 84 years old, to have stopped shrinking. She wrote about her children honestly, with the complexity they deserved, the love that had never wavered, and the anger that had been entirely legitimate, and the slow, tender work of rebuilding something that had been strained but not broken. She wrote about Edmund constantly. She talked to him sometimes too, on the porch in the early mornings, telling him how the garden was coming along and what Wanda had said that week, and how Nolan's playing had improved since he had started practicing again. She did not feel foolish doing this. She felt, if anything, accompanied. Now sitting on the porch with her coffee cooling in her hands as the sun cleared the ridge completely and flooded the clearing with clean morning light, Vivienne thought about the woman who had sat in a reading chair on Sycamore Ridge Drive 11 weeks ago, listening to her children plan her disappearance from her own life, and felt a deep and uncomplicated tenderness toward her. That woman had been afraid, and she had been right to be afraid, because what was being taken from her was real and worth protecting. But that woman had also been, underneath the fear, exactly what she had always been, capable, determined, and far from finished. She had proved something on that gravel lane between 2 cedar trees in the early morning dark, something that no nursing home brochure and no well-meaning family meeting and no amount of glossy photographs of garden view rooms could ever make untrue. She had proved that being 84 years old does not make your preferences negotiable. It does not make your autonomy transferable. It does not make the accumulated wisdom of 8 decades of living worth less than the anxiety of people who love you and cannot bear the weight of their own fear. She had proved that independence is not about being able to do everything alone. She had never claimed that, and it had never been true for anyone at any age, but about having the right to decide when and how and from whom to ask for help. She had proved that the right to live on your own terms does not expire. It does not soften with age or bend under the weight of other people's worry. It belongs to you completely, at 84 just as surely as at 34, and it is always, always worth defending. If you have ever been told that your age makes you a liability rather than a person, if you have ever sat quietly in a room while people you love made decisions about your life as though you were not present in it, if you have ever needed someone to remind you that your story is still yours to write, then you already know why Vivienne drove herself up that gravel lane in the dark. You already understand what she was driving toward. And perhaps, in some corner of yourself that has been waiting for permission to take up space again, you recognize the feeling she had when the cedar trees closed behind her and the cabin came into view, and she understood, with every part of her that had ever known anything worth knowing, that she had made it, that she was home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.